if you were to track sort of race relations in America, it seems like there was it's kind of a progression. Things are improving, through the 20th century to get to the 90s. 90s not perfect. I mean, you had OJ, you had race riots in LA, but it really seemed like things were getting better into the early 2000s, and then you get to Obama. And I'm certainly not the only person who's noticed that right around that time is where things started to go back the other direction. I mean, it wasn't long after Obama's into his second term when BLM popped up and all these things. Yeah. We started hearing about these alleged police brutality cases all the time, whereas before it was like every once in a while you'd hear.
And I think a lot of it is the rise of smartphones and social media as well, which came around that time. So everyone walking around with a camera and a video camera with them at all times, and then all of these things being on camera in many cases. I think that seeing something on video versus just hearing a story hits very differently for people in psychology. And I think it makes them feel almost like they witnessed it themselves.
Yeah.
Rather than, this is, just an article that I'm reading.
Yeah, that's interesting. But I think that does play into it. You're right. Well, anytime you're dissecting any kind of cultural change or shift, it's impossible to overstate the influence of social media and smartphones. I mean, it just changed everything. It changes the way people interact. It changes everything about being a human in the world. I mean, because this is a tangent, but it's a technology that really has no analog. There's nothing that existed like it before, because you could always say, well, cars changed the world. They did. But before that, there were horses, and cars are just a faster version of horses than they are. But with social media and smartphones, you can't really look back at something else and say, well, this is just a new version of that. It's really not. I mean, you had phones before, but you had nothing at all comparable to carrying something around in your pocket that gave you instant access to everything in the world, essentially. So anyway, that's part of it. But I also think that the Obama years contributed to this, because I think what happened was, you had these race hustlers who talked about systemic racism in America. America's systemically racist. Then we elect a black president, and to any normal, rational person, you would look at that as evidence. Now, I was not an Obama supporter, but you would at least think that, okay, well, we elected a black president. That's pretty good evidence that systemic racism is not an issue we have to worry about anymore. A black guy made it all the way to the top of the system. So clearly, this is systemic racism was not something we have to think about, which of course it is evidence of that. But the race hustlers said, well, but we can't lose that. We can't lose that cudgel to beat people with. And so they had to actually ramp up their race hustling, in order to convince people that, no, yeah, we have a black president, but no, America's still racist. So they had to desperately grasp for other examples. And so that's where BLM comes from. And that's when we started hearing about all these police brutality cases that were not Michael Brown and those sorts of things.
Yeah, it's one of the weirdest things that I've noticed is that in the past decade, I've heard the word racism and racist and the term white supremacy. I've heard them more in the past decade, certainly in the last 6-7 years, let's say, than at any other time in my life. And it seems like the better the situation gets, the more people scream and the more that they dilute the terminology as well. Like when I was, if I think back to when I was a teen or in my early 20s, if I heard that somebody was racist, or I heard someone was a white supremacist or supported white supremacy, that had a really deep and specific meaning. And now we've reached a point where I've been called a white supremacist multiple times, which is, for very obvious reasons, it's laughable. You've gotten to the point where they're talking about multi-ethnic white supremacy and how black people can be white supremacists and Asians can be white supremacists, and it doesn't matter. It's not even about being a white person. It's just that if you don't want to completely destroy everything in the system and blow it all up, and you yourself don't think all white people are racist, or you question the concept of white privilege or whatever. And now you're either a white supremacist, you're a white supremacist adjacent, or you're supporting the system and all this kind of stuff. And I mean, it's laughable on one side, like the film, but also there's something deeply insidious and perverse and anti-human about it all. And so it's funny. It's like the transgender ideology. It's laughable on one side, but it's deeply insidious and dangerous on another.
Yeah, it certainly is. And just picking up on that point, because you're right, the last 10 years, it's like we're hearing we're hearing conversation about it more than ever before, which is weird because it's like the farther we get away from a time when there was actually systemic racism in America, in Jim Crow, slavery. But the farther we get away from that time, the more we hear about it, which is a very strange thing. It's almost like what we're led to believe that somehow the legacy, the wounds of the Jim Crow era or slavery are fresher now than they were for people 50 years ago. We see the same thing with the Civil War. I've remarked on this many times. It's a very bizarre phenomenon, especially if you don't really understand where it comes from, where you have these Confederate monuments or even just Civil War monuments that had been, erected and built, put up in cities across America, especially in the South. Sometimes have been there for like 100 years. And nobody cared. It was not really a subject of controversy. It was fine because 100 years ago, people felt like, well, we're far enough away from the Civil War where we don't, it's the wounds are not fresh anymore. That's how people felt 100 years ago. But now we are less able to be rational and unemotional about the Civil War than people were 100 years ago. These are people that, they had parents who fought in the war. This is at a time when you had people that were actually slaves still living. And yet somehow now we are more emotional about it than they were. It doesn't make any sense. Why is it that, your grandparents could walk by a statue of Robert E. Lee and be fine with it, but you can't? Like, it's harder for you than it was for your grandparents. But that just speaks to what we're talking about, this concerted effort by these race hustlers to, and this is, regardless of, I use the Confederate, regardless of how you feel about the monuments and all that kind of stuff, this is where it comes from, though. It comes from this concerted effort to kind of get people to focus on these issues in a really negative way.
Yeah, it's interesting because we're having all these conversations, and at the same time, like, we all exist in the real world. And I'm not American, but I spend a lot of time in the USA. I've met, I don't know how many thousands of people here. I've been to 25 states at this point and many dozens of cities. And I see just how day-to-day Americans live in all these different cities. And for the most part, people are decent and people get on with each other. If it's interesting because if you're outside the US and you're just on social media and you're watching YouTube videos and seeing, it always looks like, it's on the verge of a civil war and everything's going to collapse and there's a race war and the left versus right and this versus that and men versus women, and it looks super chaotic and everything that's going viral is horrible and it's nasty and it's divisive and so on. And then you get there and you walk around and you talk to people and you're just like, yeah, sure, there's problems, but the vast majority of people, regardless of their background, their race, their ethnicity, whatever it is, people get on. Not everyone's like going to be best friends with each other, but people are generally polite and civilized and can coexist fine. So there's this weird juxtaposition where it looks there's these deep insidious problems, and there are things that are happening in colleges and at schools and all of that's going on, but then you just kind of walk around day to day and it seems like, if it were not for the information that's being fed to me through this device, I might not even be aware that these conversations are going on and that people are having these type of issues. So I don't know what you make of that.
Yeah, well, I think that's and that's one thing we try to bring out in the film. We have a section in the film where we go, of course, we're dealing with these so-called experts from the corporate world and academia for much of the film, but we wanted to go and talk to people that live outside of that whole world and probably have not really been exposed to it much because they don't work in corporate America. They are not college students. Many of them probably didn't go to college. And so that's a section of the film. We go to a biker bar, Confederate flags hanging on the walls and everything, but just a bunch of white guys, bikers. We go and talk to them, and then we go immediately down to New Orleans, the poor black community in New Orleans. And what we discovered, and we didn't script this, it's not like we didn't tell people what to say, but they sound, when we ask about these issues, they have the same responses. In fact, almost verbatim. We heard from both places. We all bleed the same. It was kind of their, and the message is the same. Look, I'm not focused on the race that much. I don't, if you're black or white, we can be friends. It's fine. That's the message of most people. And then not only that, but it's almost like they don't even speak the same language as these race hustlers. Because when you ask about
centering your whiteness,
decentering whiteness, or even, and that was, that was a flop. Not many people even understood what that meant.
No.
Because it doesn't mean anything, by the way. Even something that probably to you and I seems more ubiquitous, a more ubiquitous concept like systemic racism. Mm-hmm. I was actually a little bit surprised to find that even that, in these areas, it's like they've never even heard the term. They're like, what do you mean?
It's a very academic term.
Right. You have to explain what it means. And there's one of my favorite scenes in the movie, personally, is down in New Orleans, we talked to this car mechanic whose name is Milton. And we were just walking by, and this guy was outside of his shop, just kind of sitting there. And we said, "Can we talk to you?" And he was very, very friendly guy. And yeah, I'm throwing these ideas at him, and he's just kind of laughing at it. But in a warm, he's laughing at me, because I'm kind of presenting myself as someone who believes in these ideas, and he's laughing at it in it's a kind of I don't want to say patronizing. It's like almost paternalistic. Oh, you poor man, you poor confused man. And it really reminded me a lot of, there's a scene in What Is a Woman where we try to get, again, far outside, in this case, even farther outside of the bubble. We go to the Maasai tribe in Kenya. Yeah. And I'm throwing these ideas about gender and gender constructs at them. And it's the same kind of thing. They're just kind of laughing at it. And I could even feel when we left, because we never told them. In any movie, we don't tell them at the end that what this really is. It's like, because we want to maintain the authenticity of it. But even leaving that tribe, you could tell they just felt sorry for me. They were like, this guy's confused. We want to help him. And they're just laughing in a kind of warm-hearted way at these ideas. And that's how people, again, if you're outside the bubble,
yep,
that's just naturally how you respond to this stuff.